Okay, so welcome to today's talk for the Day of Security GRC Track 1. I am Chelsey Donohoe, and my first talk, or my only talk for today, is what is a gap assessment? All right, so first, a little bit about me. The first thing that you should probably know is that I have a very loud little dog. If she sees any person or critter walk by my window, she will probably bark, and I've found over the years that closing the curtains doesn't help. But she's 11 today, so everyone wish my dog happy birthday. Now, my background is actually in social sciences. So I've got an undergrad in psychology and master's in criminal justice. So my experience involves a lot of academic journal articles and reading legal texts and Supreme Court decisions, as well as case studies on how to bring evidence-based practices into the field to improve risk management efforts, particularly in criminal justice, reducing the risk of reoffending. So I took the skill set that I picked up there, a lot of research and evaluation skills, and brought that into the field of information security. And now I work with a lot of the special publications and guidelines from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as various frameworks, including privacy laws like the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, as well as industry-specific regulations like the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, particularly the security and privacy rules of HIPAA. So I'd like to know a little bit about you all. So what industry or sector do you guys currently work in? Some examples include healthcare or chemicals, financial services, or maybe you're in retail, might be transportation or working with defense, government contracting, things like that, or manufacturing. What is it that you guys are currently in? See, healthcare and university, fintech, banking and finance. Ooh, got a sim engineer on here. Cybersecurity vendor, okay. So we've got a pretty good mix. Fintech and healthcare, I've got pretty good amount of experience in doing consulting work, a lot of the highly regulated stuff. So you're probably in this talk for a reason. With your current role, to what extent are you guys involved in, or ladies, sorry, involved in your organization's governance, risk, and compliance efforts? Have you had any experience so far with things like providing data for an assessor? Have you been interviewed as part of a gap assessment or certification audit? Do you get a copy of the report whenever it comes out after the assessment? Or have you seen any of the presentations presenting your findings? PCI compliance. I'm familiar with that framework. Okay, so some experience with risk assessments. Have any of you performed a risk assessment so far? Tanisha has. Okay. All right. Got a good mix of people in our audience here. Okay. All right. And with your previous experiences with auditors and assessors, how would you describe that? On a scale of 0 to 10, how much does it hurt when someone like me comes in asking a million questions? 12. That's very tedious. No. 6. Okay. Yes, consultants are fairly common. We'll talk about that in a minute. 4. Okay. So you guys have, you've been subjected to this pain before. All right. So you're here today because you want to know the answer to the question, what is a gap assessment? Well, first off, this is going to be performed by someone either internal or external. This will typically be your IT program auditor. This is from the NIST framework from NIST. A couple of the tasks that your IT program auditor will have include reviewing or conducting audits of information technology programs and projects, providing recommendations for possible improvements and upgrades, And particularly for those with an internal role, developing methods to monitor and measure risk, compliance, and assurance efforts. This includes coming up with things like your key performance indicators, as well as your key risk indicators, all sorts of different metrics. Now, you may be wondering, how do you start an engagement like this? If you think about it like a construction project, the first thing that you need to figure out is the scope. Are you trying to build a tiny house, or are you trying to build a mansion? What is the scope of the project that you are engaging with? From there, you're going to come up with your plan. Figure out your framework. Figure out how you're going to handle this, what steps you need to take, how you're going to get there. And once you have that in place, you start to build your foundation. Having a strong foundation is going to help you make sure that your construction project works out well. Same thing happens with an assessment. So the first step is going to be the scoping. Things that you want to consider are what type of framework that you need to have. So do you have specific regulatory requirements, contractual obligations that you need to meet? Are you going for certification that has specific requirements in place? Or are you looking to implement more industry best practices and standards? What is the framework that you want to use for your assessment? Next up is the scope of systems involved. You may be looking to audit your entire security program, start to finish across the board. It may be that you're looking to focus on public cloud security, making sure that all of those issues are handled, particularly if you're in an area that's been influenced by the solar cloud breach, or before that, the various banks that have been getting hit with OCC fines, like Capital One. It may be that you're looking to have a certain office. Maybe your EU office needs to file certain paperwork showing they're compliant with GDPR, or maybe you're in California, you've got CCPA. It could also be specific systems. Say you have controlled unclassified information or a cardholder data environment that's only on a subnetwork. That subnetwork may be subject to additional security requirements beyond what the entire program needs to follow. And last, you need to figure out your resources. How many people can you dedicate to this? What's your deadline? Do you need to expedite it? If you have a tighter deadline and you want to do a deep dive, it can get expensive pretty quick. And if you have to dedicate a lot of internal resources to a project, anything that you are putting into the assessment, you have to pull away from something else. So you need to make sure that you're planning for that while you're scoping your gap assessment. For an estimate for the timeline, this is going to vary drastically based on what framework you're using, how many resources you have, if you're doing a deep dive or general overview. But for one example of a sample timeline, you can see maybe we've got 4 months to complete this audit. Maybe you've got a certification coming up in a year and you need time to remediate, redo the audit, make sure that you're ready to go before the assessor comes in for that. So the first thing that you're going to need is the data collection period. Now, I've got it marked for 3 weeks here. That might seem a little long, but it does usually take quite a while to track down all the policies and procedures that you need. Even if your point on the project has been involved in scoping and procurement and all of that, it usually there's little things that pop up here and there that you need to go back and track something down. Maybe there's an HR policy or something your physical security has that wasn't already in the binder to begin with. Once you start getting your data into the system, you start getting the documentation analysis phase. This is going to be where you do your initial SWOT analysis. That's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is where you compare what's in the documentation against what's in the framework. So these are the controls you say you're doing. These are the controls that your framework says that you should be doing. While you're doing this, you're also working on coming up with your meeting agendas and figuring out who your interviewees should be and planning for those. Your initial interviews and observations will usually take a bit of time. You may have to do some iteration, follow up on things, go check the paperwork, come back. Maybe there's something they need to do on their end. So you can start a little bit overlapping. I like to start with whichever documents that I've analyzed first. Those will be the people I interview first. The purpose of interviews and observations is to see if what's happening in practice matches what's happening on paper and how those compare to what the framework says that you should be doing. Towards the tail end of that, you're going to consolidate your findings from the documentation analysis, the observations, and the interviews. Pull them all together, and usually you're going to end up redoing your SWOT analysis again here, figuring out if something that was a weakness in the documentation is actually a strength in practice, and figuring out how that balance works out. And you're going to reanalyze your findings so that you're ready to draft the report and finalize that so you can get it into the stakeholders' hands. Now you'll notice here that the findings presentations have multiple arrows. That's because usually I end up presenting the findings as I'm handing the report over, or maybe a day or two later, just to give stakeholders an overview of here's how to read the report, here's the general findings, here's the big picture of where you should be looking. And then later you usually have 1, 2, maybe 3 different knowledge transfer sessions where you go through with a specific technical audience or executive management or whatever stakeholder group fits your needs best, and you tailor the findings to their needs so they can pull actionable items out of the report. So today's examples are going to come from the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, or NIST CSF. This is the cover page for NIST CSF. This is a risk management framework. How many of you are familiar with NIST CSF, or have your organizations been implementing NIST CSF in part or in full within your internal practices? Yes, but only in theory. That is a great answer. More ISO focus, that's a very common one, particularly if you're in an international organization that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. NIST CSF is meant to be fairly general, but it is developed by the US. So for those of you who maybe haven't read it directly yet, the formal full name of NIST CSF is the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. That's a mouthful. Everyone just calls it the Cybersecurity Framework. The reason why it says critical infrastructure cybersecurity, though, is because it's in response to a presidential order trying to secure the 16 identified critical sectors in the US. These include chemicals, commercial facilities, dams, defense industrial base, emergency services, energy, as well as the things that you might think of with like the information technology and communications, manufacturing, transportation, water systems. You also see that we've got financial services and healthcare in here as well. Those are 2 of the frameworks that I've worked with most with NIST CSF. If your organization doesn't fit into one of these, though, it's perfectly fine and acceptable and encouraged even for organizations in public sector and private sector to use NIST CSF however you see fit. So NIST CSF has 3 main components: the core, profile, and tiers. I'm going to start by discussing the core. So what is the framework core? Well, it's broken into 5 functions. This is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. That's designed to organize the core in a way that makes sense to people. Within each of those functions, we have various categories. And then those you can think of as like the topics or security control families. The categories are then, sorry, haven't used my clicker in a while, hit the wrong button there. The categories are then broken into various subcategories. These are closer to what you would expect to see with controls or security requirements and other frameworks or your clauses. But you'll see that subcategories are actually fairly vague, and you get to define them how you see fit with this particular framework. So this is the intro page to the framework core here, and we'll walk through the functions here a bit. So first off, we have the identify function, where you develop an organizational understanding to manage cybersecurity risk to systems, people, assets, data, and capabilities. You see that your categories here are things like asset management, risk assessment, risk management strategy, supply chain risk management. This is going to be the foundation for your full assessment. You need to know what your risk tolerance levels are, how the organization's grouped, where you fit into your sector or size-wise into the economy. This is all going to be the foundation that all of your controls are built on. Now, the next function here is protect. Develop and implement appropriate safeguards to ensure delivery of critical services. Now, this is going to be the bulk of what you think of with your controls. For example, we'll have our administrative controls, like having your policy and procedure binder in place and making sure everyone knows what they should be doing. Having approval workflows and manual processes like identity proofing, where your HR department compares your driver's license or passport to your actual face to make sure you are who you say you are before the IT department issues you credentials. That would be an example of an administrative control. It's a fairly manual process, but it's designed to help protect your data. You're also going to have your technical controls. These are going to be the things that most of your IT people are more familiar with, like having your access control lists in place, virtual private networks, firewalls, and so forth. You're also going to have physical controls in here. This is going to be things like having badge readers or lock and key mechanisms to protect your facilities or certain areas like a data center or IT closet. Your CCTV cameras, as well as security guards. How do you physically protect your assets? Now, our next function here, Jasmine, we've got a question here about how would this compare to the BSIMM study/framework. I'm not familiar with building security and maturity model, but I can look into that and get back to you. If you want to tweet me, I'll respond to you later today. Our next function is detect. We've got the categories here are designed to develop and implement appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. These are going to be your detective controls, like the things that your security operations center does. This will be things like looking through your security information event management system and the alerts, and what do you do if your IDS IPS goes off, or any of those things. That'll fall into detect. The next function is respond. This is where our categories are designed to develop and implement appropriate activities to take action regarding a detected security incident. So, once you have detected something or it's been reported, what is your incident response plan? How do you do that? This is going to be, it could be everything from physical security issues that require an emergency response, or it could be your containment, mitigation, analysis for your IR plan. And lastly, but not least, we've got the recover function. You develop and implement appropriate activities to maintain plans for resilience and to restore capabilities or services that were impaired due to a cybersecurity incident. This is going to be both your resiliency planning for the systems as well as your business continuity planning and disaster recovery plans. This is figuring out how to reopen or how to get back to 100% after you've had an incident. So let's take a look at our first function here, identify. And our first category that we'll be looking at now is asset management. So within asset management, you can see this is the actual framework core in the picture on the bottom here. And we're going to look at the first subcategory, IDAM1. Physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Now, you may notice here that there is another section that we haven't talked about yet, and you're probably wondering, what are these informative references? For those of you who haven't been involved in GRC at all, this may just look like a string of letters and numbers. For those of you who do have some experience with it, you'll see things like ISO 27001, NIST Special Publication 853, CIS Critical Security Controls. These are different frameworks that relate to NIST CSF in some way and help you figure out what you should be looking for with the subcategory here. So obviously, no one is going to know what these are off the top of their head. I have no idea, just looking at it, what PM5 means from 853. So you've got two different options for figuring this out. Option one is the Online Informative Reference Program. This is maintained by NIST. When you're on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework page, you notice there's a tab towards the bottom here called Informative References. If you click that last section there, Informative Reference Catalog, that will take you to this page. Here we've got the National Online Informative References Program, or OLIR. If you scroll down on the Informative Reference Catalog, you'll see the list of informative references and the focal documents of interest. For our purposes today, we're going to be focused on the ones that say Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1 as the focal document. And because 853 is such a common framework, that is what we'll look at for our example here. So clicking on that page will take you to the details for that resource. And we're going to go ahead and click on the Excel spreadsheet here to download the resource itself. Now, once you pull that up, you're going to see the Informative Reference Submission Form. This is designed to show how various 853 controls relate to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So which ones do we want to see here? We've got CM8 and PM5 relate to that subcategory that we're looking at, IDAM1. So back to our submission form here, we see that there are tabs across the bottom. This special publication 853 is over 400 pages, closer to 500. So it's organized by the different control families. So we've got the CM, which is configuration management. And then over here, we've got our PM control. We're going to focus on CM first. Just to keep things simple, we're going to go into a really deep dive on CM8 and just use that as our way of defining what IDAM1 looks like. So once we're in this tab, scroll down to CM8. And we know that first we're going to see the control number from 853. So that'll help organize it. The control description. With this framework, there's a security control baseline. 853 shows how you implement FISMA in federal agencies, but it's also the basis for other frameworks like NIST SP 800-171, which is a part of the new Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification for DoD contractors. That is largely based on the 853 moderate baseline for non-federal agencies. So the security control baseline tells you how which of these controls that you should be implementing based on what you need. Next up, we've got our rationale relationship reference document element all the way across. This is where it crosswalks what's in 853 against CSF so that you can see how they find them related. And going across, this is the same row. It just gives you more information about that relationship between these two documents in this spreadsheet. So what we're looking for here is CM8. And we'll see that the description here states, the organization develops and documents an inventory of information system components that accurately reflect the information system, include all components within the boundary, is at the level of granularity deemed necessary for tracking and reporting, and includes all of the information that the organization feels is necessary to meet those goals. In addition to maintaining that inventory, we also want to have a control in place that requires the organization to review and update the component inventory at a regular frequency. Now, our other option, if you don't feel as comfortable going through OLIR, is to go to the original source material. There's benefits both ways, and we'll go through that here in a second. So if you go to the page for In this special publication 853, we're going to use Rev 4 because that's what's referenced in the document, but as you can see here, Rev 5 will be the predominant one later this year. On the right-hand side, you can see the list of different documentation, publication, supplemental materials. So we've got the copy of 853 here, and this one's cool. You also have 853A, which provides background on how to perform an 853 assessment. So we'll start by going through CM8 in SP 853. So this is the cover page here. You can see that it's the security and privacy controls for federal information systems and organizations. Again, this was designed with FISMA in mind, but it is industry best practice across the board for everyone. Once we get into the control family, once we're in configuration management, we go down to information system component inventory. You can see here, we have the control. It is exactly the same as what we just saw in that spreadsheet. But what's cool about going to the original source material is that you also get the supplemental guidance. So this long paragraph here is NIST's explanation of what that control means, why it's important, and some examples on how you can implement it. So for example, the information that you might want to include in your inventory could be the manufacturer, device type, model, serial number, and physical location. Those are different types of information that you would want to have in that inventory so that you have the tracking and accountability. You'll also see down here that there are control enhancements. For example, we've got updates during installations and removals. This goes back to your security baseline. If you're at low, moderate, high, which of these control enhancements are should be added to ensure that your control is implemented correctly. So in this case, the organization updates the inventory of information system components as an integral part of component installations, removals, and information system updates. This is just one way of making sure that your inventory is staying up to date. Whenever you're changing things out, change the inventory too. That way you don't have inaccurate information in the inventory itself. Now, you're not actually going to lose that information if you go through OLIR. If you remember our spreadsheet that we were looking at a minute ago, we've got CM8.1 here. It's the same thing that we were just looking at. So you may have multiple lines for each one. So CM8 here relates to 4 different components from NIST CSF, the subcategories, but you're going to have your control enhancements in here as well. You can see for this one, it's going to be for the moderate baseline, and that the spreadsheet shows that it's not related to anything from the CSF. So it's a nice add-on, but it's not necessary. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we've got not only 853 itself, but we've got the 853A. The supplement is on the assessment, so building effective assessment plans. When you go into this, you've got to scroll down quite a bit. It's under the security assessment procedures. If you go through the bookmarks, and you go find CM8. And this breaks it down into the same smaller components, but it's the same control that we've already been looking at. So CM8A1, do they develop inventory that accurately reflects the information system? Does it include all components within the authorization boundary, and so forth? The same thing that we were already looking at. Now, it actually breaks down CM8B as well. So do you have controls in place to define the frequency that you expect the organization to review and update the inventory? And part 2 for that is, do you actually do the review and updates at that frequency? Not just what's in writing, but are you actually implementing it the way that it is intended? Now this one's cool because it's got the potential assessment methods and objects built straight into the document here. So we've got examples for things to examine. I personally, from this list, would want to look at the configuration management policy and the procedures addressing the information system component inventory. That was what I would ask for the documentation analysis. For the interview component, I would be focused on the personnel with responsibilities for the information system component inventory. You can also talk to the people who manage the systems that are going into the inventory, but at a minimum, I'd want to know whose job is it at the end of the day to make sure that this inventory is accurate. Then we've got our test here. This will be our observations. I would want someone to walk me through the process for developing and documenting the inventory of information system components. Show me what it is when you need to add a new system. How do you document it to make sure that it's correct? What is that process? So just for this control, this would be my assessment plan. This is the documentation analysis, interviews, and observations for CM8. Now you might be wondering, what if you need something that isn't on that list? Maybe you need an industry-specific framework or a certain certification. The cool thing with NIST CSF is that it's been pushed so heavily that a lot of organizations have started coming up with their own crosswalks. So first, you'd want to check the OLIR. This is going to be the repository of crosswalks that have been approved by NIST. They agree with what's in the spreadsheet, saying this is sufficient. We have gone through these mappings together. Now, there are some in here that go beyond just the informative references from the document that we were looking at. For example, those of you who work in healthcare, you can look at the HITRUST certification. That organization has done their own crosswalk against NIST CSF, and it's in the OLIR. For healthcare, you may also be interested in the HIPAA crosswalk between the HIPAA security rule and NIST CSF that has been developed by the US Department of Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. So HHS's OCR, the one who handles the enforcement of HIPAA, they've done their own crosswalk as well. When you look at that, they have added the HIPAA security control clauses that they felt were relevant to the subcategory of interest into that informative reference list on the right-hand side. Similarly, if you're in financial services, you might be familiar with the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. The FFIEC CAT has its own crosswalk as well, comparing the NIST CSF Framework Core to FFIEC CAT requirements. If you are familiar with the PCI compliance, the PCI Security Standards Council has mapped the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard against NIST CSF. They've taken a similar approach to what the OCR did and added the relevant security controls from PCI DSS into the informative references here so that you can crosswalk it back and figure out how to map them onto one another so that you can do both assessments at the same time if you'd like. And there are others as well. If you're in manufacturing, there's a profile for that. There's financial services profiles that are out there that are proprietary as well. Now, how do you identify gaps if there are no real controls in this framework? Like I said, the subcategories are there for guidance. It's a way to organize your risk management thoughts, but it's not specific. You're not saying you have to have these things in the inventory. You have to review the inventory annually. It's not very specific, so you get to pull whatever you need from those different informative references to figure out how you want to define that subcategory and how you choose to implement it. So for our purposes, we've gone through the core. Now let's talk about the profile. What does the analysis process look like? Honestly, in my opinion, it's like a scavenger hunt. You're going to start out with your list of subcategories or controls or security requirements, whatever your framework has. You know what it is that you're looking for based on that. And then you know what your data sources are. You're going to have your processes and procedures and policies. You have your interviews, you have your observations. That is your data for the assessment. And you're looking to find your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to go through process guidance from the Department of Defense about a particular inventory management system used by the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps. It's 10 years old, it's unclassified, it's just a very generic document to use as an example here. So we've got our subcategory, IDAM1, physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. And we've got here our CM8 from 853. That's how I'm choosing to define the subcategory for our example here. So we're looking for accuracy, comprehensiveness, the level of granularity, and the amount of information in there, plus a review process built in. So looking at our document, straight off the bat with our contents here, we see that there's going to be information about when a system should be registered, what needs to go into the inventory, different criteria and guidelines, what are the upload criteria. I see a review process listed on there. So we know we're in the right place. This is going to be about our system inventory. This is the document we want. When we're going through the introduction, I see that this figure here, it's got systems overview, lists some of the information about what you would see in the inventory, the system name, acronym, description, point of contact, lifecycle data, so forth. And we see that the purpose of this is to support operations as well as compliance needs. So let's get into the document itself. First off, when to register a system. All systems should be entered into the inventory at the time the program's established. That's great. It's nice and straightforward. So we know when the expectation is. What are they calling a system? Well, let's see. What must be registered into the inventory? To ensure that there is a complete and accurate inventory, all systems must be registered into the inventory, and a system is defined as any solution that requires a combination of two or more interacting, interdependent, and/or interoperable hardware, software, and/or firmware to satisfy a requirement or capability. That is very, very similar to the NIST definition of an information system. But because it's got the hardware in there, then we know at a minimum the physical devices and systems that we're looking for are going to be included into this inventory. It might skip some of the peripheral equipment, like your keyboard, mouse, things like that don't process information, but that's fine for this purpose. And we've got here the requirement that if an IT asset meets the definition for system, it should be registered into this inventory. Next up, we've got how to transfer ownership of the system. Now this tells us here that they're going to be assigned two portfolios based on system ownership and core functionality of the system. So it's going to be assigned to either the Navy or the Marine Corps as the owning service. That gives us some information about accountability here. And we've got our review process. For this particular system, if it's a new record, it's going to go through an individual review process before it's uploaded into the inventory. And if it already exists, then only the data fields that are changed are going to be updated, but there's also no manual review. So it's just the inventory's new records that are going through a manual review process. And we've got some information here about how to archive a system record. So if we've got, for example, data cleaning issues, like you entered something in error or there's a duplicate record, you can archive something. Or if the system itself is being taken offline, then that would also be a way to clean up the inventory to make sure your records are accurate. So we've gone through our process guidance, and we now know our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats from that. So let's start with our strengths. What I see as the strengths from what we just reviewed are that it states when assets should be included in the inventory, clearly defines what a system is, the records define system ownership with the accountability measures, and it prevents duplication of system records. That goes to garbage in, garbage out. If the information going into your system is not accurate, you're not going to get as much use out of the inventory as you could have otherwise. The weaknesses that I see here are that it's not clear which types of information should be included in each record. There's a brief list included on the intro page with the figure, but it doesn't actually get into it with this process guidance. There's also no stated frequency for inventory review or updates after the initial upload. Yes, somebody's going through and checking it off before the system goes into the inventory, but we don't know for sure whether someone's going through once a year or every 6 months and checking that these records are still accurate. Keeping that in mind, our opportunities are, first, we're going to want to go through the other documentation before saying there's definitely a gap. This is process guidance for one particular inventory. Maybe there's an asset management policy overall that already states more of the information that you would expect that goes across multiple systems of records, for example. So we want to check whether the gap actually exists first, and if it does, then the opportunity would be to consider updating the document to fill in the missing guidance. If you want to figure out how to do that, you can go to your industry best practice. For this one, that would be NIST Special Publication 1800-5, IT Asset Management. This is your practice guide from the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. This tells you what the best practices are in IT asset management. That'll help you figure out how to update your process. Now, if these opportunities are not taken advantage of, the threats that I see, or the risks that remain, are that you'd have inaccurate, incomplete, or outdated records. That goes back to the garbage in, garbage out that we were talking about earlier. And without the review process, people could be repeating the same common errors over and over again, or inefficient. You're not taking the time to figure out how to make that inventory management process better, and that's an opportunity that you'd be missing. Ultimately, the biggest risk, though, is that controls that are dependent on the asset inventory could fail. So if you have allow listing or deny listing that has to check against the inventory, and your inventory is not up to date, that control is not going to work the way that you'd like it to. So, how would you all rate this document? We know what our strengths are, and we know what our weaknesses are. So if you were the assessor and this was your subcategory, would you be willing to sign off on it, saying that, yes, they have an inventory, good enough? Would you say that the weaknesses should be remediated, at least in part? Or would you say that it's not good enough at all and you need to just start over from scratch? How would you rate this? I would say this is in the middle. The weaknesses there, the threats that I see, if they're not remediated, would cause me some concern. Now, the next question is, are documented controls implemented in practice? This is going to be where our interviews come into play, as well as our observations. Now, if I go through and find out that the gaps that we found about not having an annual review, that actually is a gap, it's not anywhere else in the documentation, and through the interviews I find out that that's not something they do either, then I would say that this, again, is right in the middle. It's partially addressed, not fully, needs some work done. You can have situations where the documentation says something happens, but it doesn't happen in practice, or where you're doing something in practice that's not necessarily documented. Either the document hasn't been updated, or people have added to controls that haven't been kept up with. There's different remediation required for each of those situations. So as you're going through the gap analysis and identifying those weaknesses, you're actually building out your profile. So this is going to be the current profile on that particular category's subcategory. We'd say it's partial. You need some work. Once you figure out what that current profile is, your organization can then figure out your target profile. Where is it that you want to get to from the current situation? Where are you trying to go? So one way to figure out where do we go from here is your action plans. The plan of action and milestones. This will include information about what was the weakness identified, how should you remediate it, who's in charge of making sure it's remediated, how many resources is it going to take, both financial, time-wise, people that you need to bring in, maybe you need a new tool or a new system in place, And of course, what is the remediation timeline? How are you going to make sure that this actually gets rolled out in a timely manner? Now, how many of y'all are familiar with action plans, either creating one or maybe you've been tasked with implementing certain remediation activities? Okay. So some of you have done action plans, some of you haven't. This is going to be part of your larger strategy. This goes back to the tiers. This is your long-term plan for figuring out how to get from where you are to that target profile. Maybe you want to mature your program along the way. There are 4 tiers with NIST CSF, from partial to adaptive. It looks like maturity levels, but that's not necessarily the case. On partial, things are informal, reactive, it's handled on a case-by-case basis. You're not necessarily thinking about your risk in comparison to others in your sector or in the supply chain. You're just trying to handle things as they come up. This is very common for smaller businesses who maybe don't have as many IT resources or experts on hand. Moving up, you've got your management is on board. It's not necessarily a full risk management culture yet, but people are starting to have some sort of awareness of that, particularly with how you fit into the larger data ecosystem. It's still usually going to be a fairly informal approach. You're not necessarily fully standardized. You might have a handful of policies or procedures here and there, but you're trying to you're not winging it as much, but you're not necessarily everything's written out the whole way. Tier 3 is repeatable. This is going to be when you have that full IT binder. You say, I need to do this. Let's go find this procedure. We've got our approval checklist. It's organization-wide. Doesn't matter which department you're in. Most people are going to be thinking about that risk management approach the whole time. Tier 4 is continuous improvement. You're trying to be like the SEAL Team 6 in your field, and you're trying to advance cybersecurity as a whole. You're working on continuous improvement internally, but also you have that strong risk management culture overall, and you're trying to be proactive and collaborative. You're taking your lessons learned and expanding them to your colleagues. That, while fantastic, is not going to be feasible for everyone. If you are focused on this, then you might not be able to dedicate enough resources to that. Now, if you find your organization is in tier 1, then it's highly recommended that you try and get yourself up to tier 2. So you start to standardize things, you at least have management approval, you start considering the risk management approaches along the way. This will help you to leverage those strengths that you have and figure out how to take advantage of the opportunities that you've identified so you can minimize the weaknesses and the threats that come along with those. Now you guys have had a little peek behind the curtain on what is a gap assessment. Do you have any questions for me? Anything that you're interested in? It looks like I went a few minutes over time, sorry. We started a little bit late. How formal does this have to be to start? That is a fantastic question. Some organizations start right off the bat with, you've got tools like Archer, RSA. Some places you just work with a spreadsheet. I've done that plenty of times where you start with just Excel, you write out your controls on one side, you figure out how the documentation fits in, figure out how your interviews fit in, and then compare across. It doesn't have to be fully formalized, just neatly organized is the biggest thing. Blog post to deep dive on this. I might have written one. I will have to go check. If not, I will look into different opportunities. Thank you. My specialization is actually in taking things like NIST CSF and multiple different standards and fitting them together before I start. That's also a great way to do that too. Like I said, this is a risk management framework that you get to tailor to what you need. So you can figure out what 3-4 different standards you need, how you're going to define that subcategory, and that way you have them all organized together as well. All right, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions or comments or would like additional information, you can tweet me at Chelsey Donohoe. My LinkedIn as well. You can send me a message that way. I am always open to helping people out.